At 6:47 in the morning, on a gravel patrol path in the forests of Nagano, a baby Japanese macaque gripped the trouser leg of a wildlife ranger and did not let go. The animal was soaking wet, barely 4 months old, eyes half shut, and it was not afraid. That was the problem. A wild infant with anything left would have fled the moment a human turned around. But this one had dragged itself across the gravel on both arms to reach him, and now held on with fingers so cold he could feel the chill through. It had been alone for at least one night, without a mother, without a troop, without enough body mass to survive what was coming. He looked up at the clouds moving in from the northwest and understood exactly what the next 18 hours were going to bring. Tonight, snow, temperatures below zero before midnight, and a 4-month-old macaque alone in the forest would not survive to see tomorrow morning. Kenji did not reach down and pick the infant up. He lowered himself slowly to the ground instead, one knee bent, one leg extended, keeping his trouser leg within reach of the infant's grip, and he waited. The first rule of contact with a wild infant is always the same. Do not force the animal to trust you. Give it the opportunity to choose. 3 minutes passed. The infant did not let go. A healthy wild macaque at 4 months would have released the moment Kenji sat down, would have retreated 2 or 3 meters, would have shown the fundamental wariness toward humans that keeps wild animals alive. But this one pressed closer instead. That told him more than any physical examination could have told him. The infant was not merely cold and disoriented. It was depleted in a way that had already bypassed instinct, that had reached the layer underneath instinct, where a young primate simply moves toward warmth because warmth is the only variable still legible to its nervous system. He unclipped his water bottle, poured a small amount into his palm, and held his hand flat at ground level. The infant sniffed, leaned forward on unsteady arms, and began to lick the water from his palm, once, then again, then a third time with more urgency, the small tongue working quickly, the way a dehydrated animal drinks when it finally understands the source is real and not going away. He refilled his palm and held it steady, and while the infant drank, he studied the condition of the fur, matted in patches along the back and shoulders, discolored at the base of the neck, where prolonged moisture had begun breaking down the natural oils that give a macaque its weather resistance. His estimate exposure to open-air conditions through the previous night, probably without shelter, possibly without physical contact with another animal for 48 hours. The wind overnight had come in at 4 degrees Celsius with intermittent rain. 4 degrees and wet fur and no body mass and no maternal warmth and no troop huddle is a specific arithmetic that produces a specific outcome. And Kenji had seen that outcome enough times to know its fate. When the infant finished drinking, it gripped his fingers not in play, not in exploration, but with the focused pressure of an animal communicating a single, uncomplicated. He stood slowly, and the infant climbed his arm. Without hesitation, crossed his shoulder and settled against the left side of his neck with both arms wrapped around his collar. The grip that infant macaques use when riding their mothers through rough terrain, tight and asymmetrical, head tucked down, feet braced against the collarbone. Kenji began walking back toward the ranger station. The infant rode. It had not chosen to follow him. It had simply moved toward the one thing its body still knew how to find. Heat contact and the rhythm of something alive moved. He kept his left hand pressed lightly against the infant's back to steady it against the jarring of his stride, and he radioed Dr. Aoki before he reached the station door. The infant weighed 340 grams on the examination table, where a healthy male macaque at 4 to 5 months should have been closer to 500, and it curled immediately into a tight ball. The moment it lost contact with his body, heat pulling its knees up, tucking its face against its own chest. In the posture infant macaques adopt when they are Dr. Yuki Aoki arrived in 38 minutes. She was the wildlife veterinarian for the Nagano Ranger District, 41 years old. And she had worked with Kenji on enough cases that she did not ask unnecessary questions. When she came through the door, she read the room, set her bag down, and began the examination in the practice sequence that moves from respiratory rate to hydration to core temperature to reflexes. her hands working with the economy of someone who had learned that speed and gentleness are not opposites. The infant stirred when she touched it, but did not fight, and it was the quietness, not the injury, not the visible distress, but the specific stillness of a young animal that had simply run out of the resources required to protest that was hardest to see. Dr. Aoki worked without speaking for 11 minutes, then straightened and pulled off her gloves. The internal organs were functioning within acceptable parameters. The dehydration was significant, but not yet at the level where intervention would fail. The core temperature was low, but recoverable with consistent warmth over the next several hours. The infant had a window, a real one, not a courtesy, if it received what it needed soon. And then she said the other thing, the thing that existed not in medicine, but in law. Under the Wildlife Protection and Management Law, a wild macaque infant could not be held at the station beyond what immediate stabilization required. The objective was always reintegration. The troop had to be found before it moved further south for the winter, before the distance between this infant and its natal group became a distance that a 4-month-old recovering from dehydration could not cross. In Nagano, the macaque troops begin their southward migration toward the geothermal spring areas in mid-November, following routes established over generations along ridge lines and creek beds that allow them to drop in elevation while staying within forest cover. It was November 14th. The troop this infant belonged to a group of between 17 and 22 individuals, tracked intermittently through 2 seasons, using the mixed cedar and beech forest along the northern Nakatsu drainage, could already be moving. If they had started 2 days ago, they were possibly 4 kilometers south, already beyond the range, where an acoustic search would be practical in the time. Kenji looked at his watch. 10:51 in the morning. Light in Nagano in mid-November was gone by 16:30. He had 5 hours and 39 minutes. He told Hayashi to start loading the acoustic equipment. The infant slept while they prepared its first real sleep in perhaps 48 hours, curled in the insulated recovery wrap Dr. Aoki had secured around it, its breathing moving gradually from the shallow, rapid rhythm of hypothermic stress toward something slower and more regular. A rhythm that was almost peaceful to watch, except for everything surrounding it. Kenji stood at the station window and looked at the forest covering the ridge, above the tiers of cedar and beech and oak. The understory visible where the canopy opened near the creek, the low-angle November light making the shadows long even in mid-morning. He had worked this forest for 28 years. He knew its drainage patterns, its microclimates, its animal corridors, the way wind moved across the northern slopes in November, the specific groves where the macaque troops historically concentrated before beginning their winter migration. And he knew, with the knowledge that comes specifically from having been wrong before, in a situation that looked exactly like this one, that knowing the forest was not the same thing as being able to predict what the forest was going to give him today. 6 years ago, he had stood at a window not unlike this one, preparing for a reintroduction that, by every measure, should have worked. The troop located the infant, stabilized the weather holding, and in the morning the infant was dead in the snow alone, and no one had ever been able to tell him why. He picked up his pack and walked to the truck. The Northern Creek route held the troop's last confirmed sign, 2 fresh latrines and a series of feeding sites in an oak grove along the upper drainage documented 4 days ago by the monitoring team. 4 days was not a long time in macaque terms, but 4 days in mid-November, with a cold front moving in and barometric pressure dropping, was enough time for a troop to read the conditions and move. They drove to the trailhead and divided into 2 teams. Kenji with the acoustic playback unit moving along the creek bed toward the oak grove, Hayashi and Ogawa taking the ridgeline above to watch for movement in the canopy. The acoustic playback unit broadcast recorded vocalizations from macaque groups, contact calls, feeding sounds. The low murmur of a troop at rest through a directional speaker. Then listened for a response with a troop in range, typically answering within 3 to 6 minutes if stationary. Kenji positioned the unit at the edge of the oak grove and activated the playback sequence. The forest received the sound. Nothing came back. He waited 6 minutes, repositioned 40 meters north, and ran the sequence again. The wind was moving from the southwest now, which should have carried the sound into the troops' likely range. If they were still in the northern drainage, but such sound in forest terrain behaves unpredictably, bending around ridge features and creek banks in ways that make the geometry of acoustic search unreliable, and Kenji had learned not to interpret silence as absence, only as uncertainty. He moved again, this time southeast toward a secondary drainage. He had not planned to work today, and ran the sequence a third time. The forest gave him nothing. Ogawa's voice came through the radio at 12:44. No visual contact from the ridge, no movement in the canopy, no sign of disturbance in the understory that might indicate a troop passing through. Kenji looked at his watch, 12:47. He had been searching for just under 2 hours and had covered the primary search area without a single response. One of the team members said what everyone was already thinking. The troop might have crossed the ridge the previous afternoon, in which case they were in different terrain now, lower elevation, closer to the spring areas, and finding them before dark was a near impossible task. Kenji didn't answer. He stood at the edge of the secondary drainage and looked south along the creek bed at the way the light was falling through the canopy, at the color of the soil where the bank had been disturbed by something passing through recently. He had been here 2 weeks ago on a routine sweep, and that disturbance had not. He knelt and found what he was looking for, the small circular impressions of macaque hands and feet in the soft soil at the waterline, clustered in the overlapping pattern of a group moving through together, pressed deep enough to suggest the animals had been here within the last 24 hours. The troop had come south along this drainage, rather than the ridgeline, passing through sometime yesterday, further along than the northern route had indicated, but not as far as the worst-case scenario. He radioed Hayashi with the new heading and told him to move. He picked up the acoustic unit and went south along the drainage, and for the first time since morning, he allowed himself to think about what came after finding the troop. The part that no amount of searching could guarantee. The part that 6 years ago had gone wrong in the dark. Without any warning. The light was changing. At 13:20 in November in Nagano, the sun was already past its peak, and the shadows were beginning to lengthen, not dramatically, not quickly, but with the steady certainty of something that cannot be argued with. Kenji moved along the secondary drainage faster than acoustic work ideally required. But the afternoon had stopped allowing for ideal. He positioned the unit at a bend in the creek, where the terrain opened slightly, a small clearing where the sound could travel without deflecting off close-standing trunks, and activated the playback. He heard the sequence go out into the forest. Then he heard something. It was faint, barely audible over the water in the creek, and the wind in the upper canopy. But it was there, the specific tonal quality of a macaque contact call, coming from somewhere to the southeast. At a distance he estimated at 300 to 400 meters. He shut off the playback and listened. The call came again. Then more voices, the overlapping vocalization of multiple individuals. The sound a troop makes when it is at rest and communicating at low intensity, not alarmed, not moving, simply. He pressed the radio transmit button, twice the team signal for contact, and held still. Hayashi's voice came back immediately. He had a visual from the ridge above movement in the canopy, approximately 400 meters southeast, consistent with a resting troop. Kenji looked at his watch, 13:47. 2 hours and 43 minutes before the light failed. He told Hayashi to hold position and not approach any pressure from above, would push the troop further southeast, and could cause them to move before the reintroduction could be attempted. Then he went back to the station truck alone and collected the infant. Dr. Aoki had kept the infant in the recovery wrap for the past 3 hours, monitoring its temperature and hydration, supplementing with warmed electrolyte solution administered with an eyedropper every 40 minutes. When Kenji came through the door, the infant was awake, not alert in the way. A recovered animal is alert, but present, eyes open, tracking movement in the room with the slow focus of something that was spending its available energy carefully. He picked up the recovery wrap with the infant inside and carried it to the truck. The infant was quiet on the drive to the reintroduction site, not sleeping, just still pressed against the warmth of the wrap, occasionally turning its head toward the window as the forest moved past outside. Kenji drove without the radio. He had done reintroductions before more than 40 in 28 years, involving 6 different species, in conditions ranging from optimal to nearly impossible. And he had developed a practice before the difficult ones of allowing a period of silence, not to prepare himself emotionally in any formal sense, but simply to let the situation exist without narration for a few minutes. To resist the human compulsion to arrange the facts into a story before the story had finished happening. He parked 200 meters from the troop's position and carried the infant the rest of the way on foot. The troop was in a section of mixed forest where the cedar thinned and a stand of old-growth beech took over large-trunked, high-canopied trees that created an open quality of space beneath them. The afternoon light coming in at a low angle through the upper branches and falling in long, pale shafts on the leaf litter below. 17 individuals visible. They were resting in the way. Macaque troops rest when they have eaten well and have not been disturbed. Scattered loosely across an area of roughly 40 meters, some in the lower branches, some on the ground. The younger ones engaged in the half-hearted play that characterizes a troop in a comfortable. The alpha female was on the ground, sitting with her back against a beech trunk near the center of the group. Large for a female, heavier than average, with a silver-gray patch across both shoulders that had made her easy to track for the past 3 seasons, and the one whose response in the next few minutes would determine what the rest of. Kenji stopped at the edge of the clearing, approximately 22 meters from the nearest troop member, and crouched. He opened the recovery wrap slowly. The infant blinked in the light. It looked at the trees. It looked at Kenji. Then it turned its head toward the troop, and something in its posture changed, a subtle reorganization, a shift in the quality of its alertness, as though a circuit had been reconnected, that had been dormant for 2 days, and it made a sound very quietly, a low vocalization that Kenji recognized as the contact call that infant macaques use to locate their mothers. Several adult females in the troop raised their heads. The alpha female did not move. Kenji set the infant down on the leaf litter. Then he stepped back 1 step, 2 steps, 3, keeping his face toward the forest, not turning his back, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood that the next several minutes did not belong to him. The infant stood on the ground for a moment, unsteady, its legs adjusting to the surface after hours in the recovery wrap. It called again, louder this time, more insistent. 3 adult females were watching now, 2 of them sitting up from their resting positions, oriented toward the sound. The alpha female had not moved. Kenji was 30 meters back, standing behind a cedar trunk where he could see without being seen directly. And he counted his own breathing. This was the part that no protocol addressed, that his 28 years of accumulated knowledge was entirely unable to influence. This was the part that belonged to the animals, and to whatever criteria they used to make the assessments that humans were not equipped to observe or measure. The alpha female stood up. Kenji stopped breathing. She took 1 step toward the infant and stopped. The infant called again, the same sound, the same frequency, smaller, in amplitude now, as though the uncertainty of receiving no response had already begun to cost it something. The alpha female stood absolutely still for 4 seconds. Then she took another step. She covered the distance to the infant in a slow and deliberate approach that took approximately 40 seconds. Pausing twice, lowering her head to read the air, and when she was close enough, she extended her muzzle and made contact with the top of the. She inhaled. She withdrew slightly. She inhaled again. Then she sat down beside the infant and began to groom it. The first pass of her fingers across the infant's back, slow, methodical. The particular focused attention that macaque grooming carries was the moment Kenji understood that the decision had. He exhaled. 3 other females had moved toward the infant, drawn in by the alpha's acceptance, forming the loose cluster that macaque troops form around a returning or newly admitted member. Not crowding, not competing, simply being present in the radius that signals inclusion. The infant pressed against the alpha female's side. Its hands found the fur at her ribs and gripped. Hayashi was standing 5 meters behind Kenji and said something very quietly. Kenji registered the words without processing them, the way you register ambient sound when your attention is entirely elsewhere. He was watching the alpha female. She had lifted her head from the infant and was looking in his direction. He did not know what she saw. He did not know what framework a macaque alpha uses to categorize a human who has spent the afternoon moving her troop's lost infant across difficult terrain in the 40 minutes before dark. And he was not going to pretend that he did. He bowed his head. It was a small movement, almost involuntary, and he would not have been able to explain it to anyone who asked. Not as communication, not as gesture with deliberate meaning, not as anything he had decided to do. It was simply what his body did in that moment, and he left it at that. The alpha female held his gaze for 2 more seconds, then turned back to the infant. The troop began to reorganize around the returned animal individuals, shifting their positions, the loose afternoon scatter, tightening into the closer configuration of a group preparing to move. And Kenji recognized the signs of departure. The alpha female rising. The peripheral animals becoming more attentive. The juveniles abandoning their play and moving toward the center of the group. They were going to move before dark. That was correct. They needed another 3 or 4 kilometers before they reached the lower elevation spring area, where they would spend the winter, and they needed to cover it before the temperature dropped and the coming snow made the terrain unreliable. The infant was with them now. No longer a problem to be solved, simply a member of its troop moving when they moved. Stopping when they stopped, carried in the alpha female's vicinity as the group made its way south through the beech forest in the last workable light of the afternoon. Kenji watched them until the last animal had disappeared into the trees. He stood in the clearing for some time after, in the way that people stand, in the places where things happened, before they go back to the ordinary sequence of tasks that constitute a day. Hayashi was behind him quiet, giving him the time without being asked. The light in the clearing was moving toward that particular quality of late November, late afternoon that exists in the 40 minutes before actual darkness, still visible, still functional, but changed in character, the color draining from the air, the shapes of the trees becoming more defined against the sky as the contrast increased. Kenji bent down and picked up the recovery wrap from the ground. He folded it slowly, the way you fold something without thinking about the folding, because your attention is somewhere else, creasing the fabric along the existing lines, compressing it into the shape that fits back into the pack. Hayashi looked at the tree line, where the troop had gone, and asked the question that Kenji had known was coming, whether they ought to give the infant a name now that it had made it through. Kenji tucked the folded wrap into the side pocket of his pack and pulled the zipper closed. He told Hayashi that the infant already had a name, that it had always had one, and that the troop had known it all along. Hayashi didn't say anything after that. Kenji picked up the acoustic unit, coiled the cable around the housing in the sequence that prevented tangling, and set it in the equipment bag. They walked back to the truck along the drainage, moving quickly now to use what remained of the light, the forest on either side settling into its evening configuration, the birds going quiet, the small animal movement in the understory becoming more cautious, the whole system shifting into the register it uses for the hours of darkness. At 17:04, the first snow began to fall. It came in slowly, not the dramatic opening of a heavy snowfall, but the tentative beginning of one individual flakes appearing in the beam of Kenji's headlamp as he walked the last 100 meters to the truck, sparse enough that each one was distinguishable, dense enough that you understood more was coming. He got in the truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about the infant 6 years ago. The one that had not come back, the one the troop had turned away in the dark for reasons he had never been given and had stopped expecting to receive. He thought about this morning's infant, small enough to fit in his jacket pocket, gripping a stranger's trouser leg in the cold because it had nothing left and nowhere else to go. And the alpha female's hands moving across the infant's back in the clearing, methodical, unhurried, as though there had never been any question. He did not know what the difference had been between today and 6 years ago. He was not sure he needed to. The snow was falling on the beech forest to the southeast, on the route the troop had taken, on the leaf litter, where 17 or 18 or 20 macaques were now moving through the last kilometers of their winter migration together, including an animal whose name none of the humans involved in the last 10 hours had ever known. The troop knew it. That was enough. He started the engine, turned on the headlights, and pulled back onto the forest road toward the station. Behind him, the trees stood in the new snow without any record of what had passed through them. The forest carrying its information in a language that leaves no trace for the people who pass through, looking for evidence that something happened here, something that mattered, something that came out differently than it might have. The road curved north. The headlights swept across cedar trunks, across the pale faces of roadside boulders, across the empty gravel of the trail junction, where a small monkey had gripped a trouser leg 10 hours and 17 minutes ago and refused to let go. Kenji drove. The snow kept falling.